Alright, so today we're going to be talking about one of the issues that can be considered one of the probably most severe problems of Total War Warhammer. And one that has already been fixed in several other Total War games, so the future very much looks bright for it. But it is a significant talking point nonetheless, and that is diplomacy. In the game right now, diplomacy is it's bizarrely restrictive. It makes the AI behave in weird ways. There definitely seems to be an anti-player bias, which shouldn't be too big of a surprise because the game is partly built with an anti-player bias. And to a certain degree, that's never going to go away because otherwise the game might be too easy because the AI just isn't smart enough to stay competitive. But it is nonetheless a issue in ways that it really shouldn't be. Particularly getting, let's say, trade agreements or confederations can be unnecessarily rough. And Creative Assembly knows this, because out of the factions that have been updated recently, the Empire, Wood Elves, and Greenskins, oh, and Bretonia, actually, come to think of it, have all recently had new ways to force confederation added. Because Creative Assembly knows that the diplomacy system is a little fucked up. And going even further than that, way back in Warhammer 1, Norska, I believe, was the first faction to gain the ability to force confederation. While Bretonia got a massive bonus to it, it nonetheless was not strong enough, and you'd still have situations where playing as Bretonia, you'd have plus, 500 diplomacy with a other Bretonian faction, and they still would ignore confederation appeals. So Creative Assembly is aware this is a problem, and the changes to the diplomacy system that we have seen in Three Kingdoms and Troy ideally should be implemented. And the big thing that I really got to highlight with Three Kingdoms and Troy is that they let you see what the AI thinks of a given diplomacy deal in terms of a kind of numeric value. And so when you have a deal, like, let's say you're trying to get, let's say you're playing as the vanilla dwarves, Karazakarak, you're trying to get Beric Var to sign up for a trade agreement, and they say no. In Warhammer, it just gives you kind of a red little hand symbol saying, no, this isn't going to happen. In Three Kingdoms, or Troy, and I should note I've not put in too much time with either of those games, so excuse me if I get something wrong, but in those games, they would instead have a little minus 30 number. And then if you want to try and sweeten the deal to get Beric Var to agree to this deal, you could throw in a little bit of money or throw in a deal that they actually like, and that might make the negative number go up positively. And once it gets to positive, they will agree to it. Now, some people, understandably, would not like this system because it is very video gamey, right? To just already know ahead of time. But the thing is, when there's no downside to getting your deals rejected, there's no reason to not just keep suggesting the same deal over and over and just slightly sweetening the pot every time. So it's really just saving time. So I think that would be one of the most fundamental quality of life features to implement in Warhammer, and probably one of the easiest ones, because it's just clarifying systems that are more than likely already in the game. Of course, beyond that, there's several diplomacy options which are not available that really should be, and the big one definitely is the ability to trade provinces. And I understand that Creative Assembly may not have chosen to have that in the game initially because the idea of, let's say, Blizzardmen selling a part of Lustria to Bretonia for, $5 wouldn't exactly work. And the system would be a little fucked for some factions. There'd have to be a lot of balancing work. Because, let's say, the Tomb Kings have a terrible economy relative to everyone else on the map. So for the Tomb Kings, they might be inclined to sell loads of provinces just because they're dirt poor. So there'd have to be balancing work done around that. But I think it is a required quality of life feature just to have allies be worth keeping around. Because it is a bit of a problem in the game right now that if you raise a province belonging to an enemy, your ally may swoop in and take it. Or conversely, if an enemy raises one of your provinces, an ally may swoop in and take it, and you may want that province. And the only way to get it back is by going to war with your ally, which is generally not ideal. That is, I think, just a quality of life necessity to deal with that and to make allies more worth having. And allies can be difficult to have in the first place in this game because the AI is not great at coming to your aid when necessary. There is the ability to tell them to focus on a certain settlement, but the AI is not particularly aggressive about it. And I get that to a certain degree they can't make allies that much worth it because it might make the game too easy. And honestly, like, the only way you could get the AI to really behave how the player wants them is just to put them under direct player control. And that certainly isn't happening. So I'd feel like the best way to handle it would just be implementing like something along the lines of the intervention system. That's kind of iffy, though. Allies, they could absolutely keep allies the way they are in the game, and they'll just kind of be not very useful, especially because they tend to assume that you'll come to their aid without actually coming to your aid very often. The system that I think would really help the game, though, with alliances is one that I would think would be opposed to the player, actually, though. And that is, if memory serves, Three Kingdoms has a system of there it is, coalitions. Coalitions, I do not know if they're available to everyone. They're definitely available to Yun Chao. I've not played Yun Chao. But the idea of multi-faction alliances that join together, especially in opposition to big threats, I think could be a really interesting way of handling that late-game grind, which is a serious problem for a lot of people. Snowballing is something I can put up with, but a lot of people understandably do not want to put up with it. They want to face a challenge for the entire game. And for them, Warhammer often lacks that, because the AI has trouble building up speed as quickly as the player does. And the player even has the rather significant inhibition of the supply line system. So I think coalitions would be a good way of dealing with that. Make it where factions that are not already allied to you or in a non-aggression pact with you might form coalitions once you pick up too much speed. I know that the realm divide mechanic in Shogun 2 was very unpopular at the time, and I think there's still some kind of resentment towards it now. But I think that there is actually really something there as a way of keeping the game difficult, even once you get very strong. Perhaps build a way to make the system more predictable, make it where, you won't get declared war upon by your own allies, but nonetheless have a system where, let's say, if the Empire's getting too big, a coalition forms of, let's say, Norska and the Greenskins and Beastmen and, Dark Elves or what have you. Depending on the size, of course. And this could, of course, work for factions that are of the same race. I mean, the Warhammer map is huge. You could have, let's say, all the dwarfs. If Grimgor Ironhide picks up too much speed early game, which he usually does, then the dwarfs and the border princes, because they're in the kind of region to be threatened by Grimgor, form a coalition. I think that could be an interesting way of handling that. And I actually have written down here a couple nitpicks. But I'll just throw down the one nitpick I do have here is this is a problem for several factions, but not others, is the trade system being based off the capital location. And this is, like I said, a nitpick. It can be more of a problem for a small amount of factions than for others. The Empire is never going to have a problem with this, because they start off in Altdorf, and they already get a port, right? Most factions are going to start off in a good position to get a port. But there are several factions like, let's say, the Wood Elves, who have trouble getting access to trade, and pretty much all of the factions that are on the Eastern Southlands or in the Southern Darklands, like Malice, Darkblade, or Kroakgar. And God, Malice's name sounds so fucking stupid, it crawls out of my mouth. Yeah, Kroakgar, who has a less stupid name, have trouble getting trade going because the ports that they have access to are not considered to connect to the rest of the ocean. and can really only trade with the little sort of Indian Ocean equivalent present there. So that is a problem there. Though I think that problem may actually be one that could be fixed simply by the existence of the Warhammer 3 Mortal Empire's equivalent map, as Creative Assembly has implied that they're going to fill out the rest of Southlands and Lustria when they do that map, in which case the problem would be solved simply because one can sail around the Southlands. That'd make it a lot easier. So yeah, diplomacy I think is one that, with sieges it's a serious question, how can they fix it? And with the race selection, it's kind of a no-winning question, because there's always going to be unrealistic desires. But with diplomacy, there's already serious potential for fixes, just based off the systems they're in Three Kingdoms and Troy, and based off the changes that they're inevitably going to make with the game. So, I think in terms of diplomacy, the future for Warhammer 3 is almost assuredly just guaranteed to be bright.